Hello and welcome to Talk Gnosis. I'm Deacon John, and today we're interviewing Dave Pantano about his book Alchemical Hermeticism: The Secret Teachings of Marco Daffi on Initiation. Hello, Dave. Thank you for joining us.
Hi, John, and hi, audience. It's great to be here.
Yeah, it's great having you. We're both a podcast and a YouTube video show for people watching at home. You can see that Dave has the book. Do you mind flashing it again, Dave? And we will have a link in the show notes where you can buy it. It's a very fascinating book, and I think a lot of people who have interests in this area, particularly in the Anglosphere, would not be familiar with a lot of the material, with the thinkers and the philosophers, occultists that are addressed within, and Marco Daffi himself. So, Dave, who was Marco Daffi?
Okay, yeah, great question. And that's really the $1 million question of the book. Who is Marco Daffi? It's not anyone who was born with that name. It's a mystery. It's the archetype of an individual who was born a baron, a full name Ricciardo Ricciardelli in Naples of 1900 and died in 1969. Was born to one of the wealthiest families of Italy that owned large amounts of land and orchards across central and southern Italy. He grew up with all the prestige and benefits that goes with being part of a noble family with a lot of assets. And he, I guess at an early age, in his late teens, it was common at that time, put into an arranged marriage with a countess. And he found out that him and his wife didn't really get along. There wasn't any connection, and he wasn't able to consummate the marriage. The Baron Ricciardelli tended to be a loner and tended to be shy, introverted, have issues with women in general. So in the early 20s, he went to a psychiatrist to see what could be done about it. And the doctor turned out to be the head of one of the local chapters of the Therapeutic Magical Fraternity of Miriam, which was the leading magical order of the day in Italy, sort of like what the Golden Dawn is in English-speaking world. It was the sort of like the dominant, the go-to area. It had, I think, at its height, something over 700 members, and they practiced a lunar type of rituality, which is to build up purity that allowed one to transfer this purified energy to those who are in need of it, whether through vitality or whether they were some sort of sickness. So in the mid-20s, Baron Ricciardelli went to this doctor who turned out also to be a head of this magical order. And the doctor wasn't able to help Ricciardelli to deal with the issues of intimacy with his wife and some of the other psychological imbalances he had, specifically related to women. But he passed Ricciardelli on to his master, which happened to be the founder and the leading magus of Italy, called Giuliano Kremerz. And Kremerz is well known in Italy and across Europe. His number of books have been translated, and he's recognized as someone with a very authentic lineage, powers, so on and so forth. And he also happened to be a doctor, a naturopathic doctor as well. And he took Ricciardelli on as what they called back then a disciple, but an independent one. He recognized that Ricciardelli had very acute psychic abilities. He had an above average ability to recall events, and that he had very strong intuitive qualities. He was very erudite in all things spiritual, whether it was of the Western tradition or the Eastern tradition. So Kremerz gladly took Ricciardelli on as his disciple to help him to understand what his ailment was and what they could do about it. And Kremerz, through a number of his diagnoses, was able to identify that his imbalance, a psychological imbalance, was more than just situational or environmental or family. It had deeper karmic causes associated with that. And he provided Ricciardelli some rituals to help him to get inside himself and to understand what these forces are that were behind the infirmities that he had with his wife and with women in general. So these type of rituals is what we would call these days past life regression. So going inside oneself to understand what one's innate qualities are, or what those forces that are inside that precede our conscious level, not those habits and not those qualities and attributes that one picks up through education, through society, through the norms of the culture and so forth, but those innate tendencies that one has. In Ricciardelli's sense was a sense that he liked to be alone. He had a very introverted type of personality that would go inside, and very heightened intelligence. So he was able to put together a profile of these innate qualities and presented it to Kremertz, and it was determined that it was some sort of issue that occurred deep in his psyche that he needed to explore through dreams and meditations, what they call sacred representations, those type of lucid dreams where these the scenarios and the images of and figures that present themselves in, whether it's in deep meditation or in visions, imagination, dreams, whether these images had a symbolic nature to it, archetypal nature. And through these practices, these dreamscapes, that Ricciardelli was able to determine that he, in a past life, was a priest of a temple of the sun of ancient Egypt, and that he had committed a number of transgressions, such as he had an illicit affair with the pharaoh's wife, and he had misappropriated some of the assets of the temple. So these were the images that appeared to Ricciardelli in these heightened state, or these altered states of consciousness. And it also determined that his name as a temple priest was Marco Hekdaf, which was a Phoenician name that he had when these transgressions occurred. And he was able, once he recorded this information, when he came back into his normal state of consciousness, or his profane state of consciousness, he was able to record this. And that name, Marco Hekdaf, he determined was his archetypal name. And in Italianized, it became Marco Daffi. So that's the story behind the name and the context. Unfortunately, around this time was 1930, and Kremertz had died. So Ricciardelli, who at this time identified himself with his archetypal name, Marco Daffi, was left with a conundrum in terms like, I understand what the situation is and what's causing this imbalance with women, and specifically with his wife. And he tried to understand how he could correct those deeply psychological infirmities. Before Kremertz had died, he had put Ricciardelli, I'll call him Daffi from now on, because that's the anterior name of the Baron Ricciardelli, with this Egyptian order. The Egyptian order were these 12 sages that oversaw the Egyptian type esoteric orders of Europe. So like the Memphis and Mizraim, the Hermetic Brotherhood of Luxor, the Fraternity of Miriam, etc., etc. And so through Daffi's interaction with this Egyptian order, he was given further rituals to determine how to correct those imbalances. And I'll take a pause here. I don't know how far you want me to get in. But that was the premises. I will have to say that's the second half of the book. The first half explores Daffi's incredible knowledge of Hermeticism. So he was a scholar. Besides being this really adventurous, experimental psychonaut, someone who would go inside his inner space and be lucid and active. So his fluid body wasn't passive like a zombie, like it is with some of us, but he was actually lucid, and he was able to have a degree of autonomy in this astral state as Marco Daffi. Hence, he transferred his identification from the Baron Ricciardelli to this psychonaut called Marco Daffi. But I want to focus also on his extraordinary erudition, that the material that he writes about, Alchemical Hermeticism, is unparalleled in modern day occultism in terms of his articulation of this pathway, how to actually go inside oneself and discover one's archetypal self, and the process of alchemical hermeticism, which is the process of transformation. As we all know, alchemy is about transforming lead into gold. In the initiatic world of alchemical hermeticism, the object and subject of the laboratory is one and the same. It's the individual, specifically the individual consciousness. So to transform from a profane consciousness, one that's anchored into the external senses that are tied to the world of three-dimensional relativity, to a more deeper world of the astral plane, where that whole matrix of time, space, and causality operates at a different level, where the density of the energy is much less than in the profane world. Hence, it's much more conducive for inner transformation. So I wanted to highlight to the audience that Daffi has written an incredible amount of work, both at a theoretical level on alchemy and alchemical hermeticism, but also lays out the processes and the methodologies in terms of how one can explore one's past life or one's inner self, and to be able to transform that, to be an actor in this universe of forces both without and within. So I'll pause here, John, if there's anything you want me to go deeper in, or if you want me to continue more about the life of Daffi. I'll leave it to you to drive us where we're going to go on this in this interview.
I think that we should return to his life, but since we're on the topic, with his alchemical hermeticism, does he really lay everything out in a systematic way? Is he a systematic thinker who very clearly tells you, okay, these are the steps for this alchemical transformation? Or is it a little bit more suggestive? Is it a little less precise so you can kind of have some guidance and find your own way? I'm wondering if you can tell us a bit about.
Yeah, I mean, I can only respond in terms of my relationship. He is very precise in terms that he lays out the three phases of alchemy: the nigredo, the albedo, and the rubedo. And it aligns with the sort of initiatic matrix, where the hero goes to the underworld, to the unconscious, to the black world, where through a process of sublimation of consciousness to the irreducible element of the psyche, where any further than you've lost that individual light. The light is absorbed into the universal light. That process of sublimation to the first matter, or the materia prima, he outlines clearly methodology. It starts with a consciousness that doesn't attach to here or to there. It's that sense of entering into the void. It's a sense of putting the corporal aspects of the individual, of the psyche, to sleep, to rest, to become latent. So in the Miriamic or Kremer's constitution of the human, there are four bodies, which is common with this ancient Greek classification of life, of matter, that it has four bodies. It has an external body. And again, when we say body, we're talking about frequencies of energy. It's all interconnected, but the vibrational frequency of the energy of a specific layer of the individual is either at a lower or denser level, or at a higher, more sublime. So the external level, the outside, is called the Saturnian. The one that's more sublime than that vibrates at a more subtle frequency, is called the lunar. So it's associated with the emotional centers, the nerve centers. The more sublime than the lunar is the intelligence, called the mercurial. And the highest one is at the archetypal level, is the solar one. It's all interconnected as a unicum, but it's important to understand when one is one is a mist or a seeker, to understand at what level their center of their consciousness is at. For most individuals, it's at that Saturnian level. Again, we identify with the objects of our external senses. Well, that needs to be refined, so there's a much more interpenetrative aspect to consciousness that's able to transfer its center from the external senses to the internal ones, specifically at the lunar level, where one at an astral dimension, one can be lucid, one could be having a sense of autonomy to be able to do a lot of these practices at that level. So to answer your question, yes, it's very systematic in the sense that it takes the seeker, or as I refer to as the hero, the magical hero, because it follows that path of the heroic path of going through an underground to confront one's disturbances, to confront one's imbalances that are there at the root of one's psyche, but one's not aware of it. So once one is able to sublime and reach that primal level of the materia prima, we're talking about consciousness at a quantum level. And at a quantum level, the energies are very dynamic. And for a lot of people, it stops right there, the initiation, because they can't handle the explosion of that level of consciousness, of that dark matter, of that shadow. But he provides a lot of examples in terms of how to address that, how to confront one's shadow, how to confront one's unconscious or one's black matter, black astral, through the white light, through the white astral. And from there, there's methodology to address those infirmities at an unconscious level, and then to purge oneself of them through various means of purification, and then to integrate one's energetic body at that purified level called the miriam. The miriam refers to a state of being, state of consciousness that is separated from any profane influences, but it resonates at very high frequency, still conscious of this consciousness that's able to move among the various bodies and be autonomous. It's not linked to the profane element of the self. That has been addressed in that first stage, the black phase. So once one reaches that level of the miriam, or the white of the albedo, then there are further practices in terms of how to complement the vices that one has with the appropriate virtues, the 7 universal lights, to be able to integrate and to elevate the soul, or elevate the numen to that red level, to that rubedo. So all that process, that alchemical process of addressing one's shadows, of purifying oneself of that, and to transform or complement one's vices by detaching from them and affirming the appropriate virtues, and understanding that mission, or that ascending energetic force of flame that represents one's missions or one's true calling in life. So try to summarize a 500-page book into about 5 minutes.
I don't, and I think you did an amazing job summarizing all of this very dense material. But I would like to circle back to the life of Marco Daffi, if we can finish up on that, because we left him, I think, in the 30s.
So in the 30s, as we mentioned, so through these practice of self-remembrance, Daffi was able to identify that the root cause of his difficulties with his wife, with his women, was a result of this transgression he created that appeared in dreams. So it's not just one dream, it was a recurrent pattern that came up. And I have in the book a testimonial where he was doing a practice of clairvoyance with the other member was able to see in his vision that there was a temple that looked like a temple, and there appeared to be a priest or a sacerdote at the temple that was doing a process, who had a beard, and it resembled somewhat of Ricciardelli / Daffi. So these visions he had, or these images and remembrances of past life representations, was a constant. And so he was able to link together that the root cause of his difficulties to deal with women was a result of that impropriety of having an illicit affair in the temple. And so he Kremers had died. He went to this Egyptian order that provided Daffi with some rituals to do some past life regression, and also some psychergic rituals. Psychergic rituals are those rituals where as in the ancient Greek and Egyptian temples, where the efficient or the mist would go in and weigh their soul to determine their sort in life or in the post-mortem. So there were a number of rituals called the Medicina Dei. So the rituals, the medicine of the gods, or the divine medicine rituals, which are about to correct the imbalances that he incurred as a result of this karmic curse, but also to weigh the soul to see whether the appropriate retribution of the damaged aspect of his lunar body, of his body that has to do with with loving, with connecting with the woman, to basically to marriage his archetypal feminine, or that feminine component with his masculine. So the animus with the anima with the animus. It's about to heal them together, so it becomes it's not a fractured psyche, it's a full psyche. So similar to Jung talks about, that individuation process when the anima and the animus are integrated, when the dark shadow is integrated with the light. In alchemy, it's talk about the marriage of the king and the queen. This is that level, but this is, again, precedes this work by about decades. And so he was able, through the Egyptian order, to understand what those issues were and how to resolve them. It turned out in the mid-30s that Daffi met up with Kremertz's grandson, who Kremertz had advised Daffi prior to him dying that his grandson had very prodigious, he was destined to be another Kremertz, and so on and so forth. So Ricciardelli, or Daffi, if you prefer, became close with Kremertz's grandson, and they were doing some magical rituals. And it was determined before Kremertz had died that there was this a Swedish magus called Kabux that could help Ricciardelli, or Daffi. And so Daffi used Kremertz's grandson as a medium to be able to channel this entity called Kabux to help quicken the healing of his karmic deficiencies, of his karmic retributions. And it turned out that Kremertz's grandson was misappropriating Daffi by claiming that he was channeling him. So Daffi's wife, the Countess de Lourdes, Daffi was handing over money over to Kremertz's grandson because Kremertz's grandson, who was channeling this Swedish magus called Kabux, was indicating that he needed money to be able to heal completely Daffi. So Daffi was happy to give this money over because he felt it was another retribution that he had to clean up. So remember, I said that in his dreams, or in his visions, he had an illicit affair with the pharaohs. He also had misappropriated some of the assets of the temples. To correct that transgression, he felt he had to rid himself of his family's wealth. Once his wife got hold of this, she called the cops. There was a trial. It made the front page newspaper. It's called the Trial of the Magus. I have some photographs in the book of the front page news. And it turned out that, make a long story short, it made headlines. University students, lawyers were attending it because, this was like another trial, like Cavapulius of the classical world. Mm-hmm. It turned out that the judge presided, defense and prosecution made their cases. The judge presided, indicating that Daffi was mentally unstable or ill, and that Kremertz's grandson was taking advantage of him, and that he sentenced Kremertz's grandson to prison and ordered him to pay a portion of the money that was expropriated, using the legal terms, whether it was gladly handed over by Daffi to Kremertz's grandson is another story, and that Daffi was to be put under psychiatric care for the rest of his life. And so it turned out that this was actually a blessing in disguise. And I read a number of Daffi's letters that in private archives to a number of people, indicating that for him, it was like a boon, because now he could concentrate on his studies, on his inner laboratory without any interference. And he felt that he had cleaned his karmic guilt of, stealing or misappropriating assets, and that he was also able to heal his resentment he had with his wife and with women in general. So the coincidence is his best material came after the war in the 40s, the 50s, and the 60s. Ricciardelli was invited as a guest speaker to some of the most famed academies of Italy at that time, the Academy of the Links that goes back to Galileo and Da Vinci from Tuscany. Then there's also the Roman Academy of Tibernia, another famous ancient academy. He would be invited to lecture on all aspects of spirituality, whether the East and the West. And he also was invited to head up a number of psychic research centers at the time. There were a number of well-known psychic researchers in Europe, and that Daffi was on the board for them. And he was recognized. I had also testimonies in the book that he was recognized for having extraordinary abilities in the psychic world, whether it was through divination, channeling, dream interpretation. He was very fond of using the I Ching or the Tarot cards for intuition and foresight and so forth. So he was able to write these amazing works that outlined in detail the process and methodology of inner transformation. And he called his alchemical hermetic practice a gnosis. A gnosis in the sense that it opened up a channel to this interdimensional world of the astral that one can go in, and through this process of inner purification, that the fluid body, the energies of the lunar, Mercury, and solar bodies wouldn't dissipate or wouldn't dissolve through the pressures of this other dimension, but would remain intact. And in fact, that one could actually have an active energetic body, an active consciousness, to be able to participate in a free-willed manner in these altered states of consciousness. So that's all those the methodologies and processes and results are articulated in the book.
Yeah. Well, coming back to the book and to, in some ways, to move the spotlight from Daffi to Dave, how did you get interested, like, in Daffi, in his world, and how did you come to translate and compile these previously untranslated writings into this book?
Well, I became acquainted with Giuliano Cremert, so Daffi's mentor, if you want, in the 80s through the works of another Italian esoterist, the notorious Julius Evola, who wrote highly of Cremert as being this master and so on in a number of his books, such as the Hermetic Tradition or the Introduction to Magic of the Ur Group, or Masque and Visage of the Modern Spiritualism. He writes quite extensively about Cremert and the Miriam and how ahead of their time they were. So from reading Evola, I was tapped into, I did some research and found some works from Cremert and just was blown away by the erudition and the insights that I found there. I guess I just happened to stumble across, when you do this inner work. So the Miriam, the work of the Miriam works very much with magnetism. So when you're able to sublimate your consciousness to that level of primality, where you strip yourself of all these excretions that you pick up through the profane world, through family, society, school, etc. Once you're able to reduce your consciousness to its prime state of individuality, to a monadic unity of consciousness, there's a polarization that occurs. There's a positive charge of a frequency, which we call the aura. There's also a negative charge, which we call magnetism, which receives energy. So once has the eye to see these things, a lot of synchronicities occur. So that's how I make sense of it, John, is that then once you do this work and this practice, and your center of being is at a much subtle level than you are in your profane life, then these things attract each other. Like attracts like. The negative charge of receiving energy, the energy you put out from your positive charge comes back in very subtle ways. And through the logical mind, when I say logical mind, I mean the rational mind that we're taught up, we don't pick that up. We call it coincidence or I stumbled across it. But it really is not. It's because this is where your focus is. Your heart, your lunar body is sending out this energy in these subtle channels, and it comes back in this way. And that's how I happened to come across Daffi's work, which would have been in the late 80s. And once I read it, I couldn't leave it go. I continue to go back to it just because it's so deep and profound, and it's so tangible in the sense that you can validate these processes and these practices by doing them yourself, by being aware of it. And the first time you read it, it's like any good book. You only pick up a certain level of the meaning, but there's always a continuous excavation for deeper and more universal meanings. So that's how I make sense of it. Because these books of his were published very small prints, 500 copies of 500, and they were soon sold out. I was looking for a copy. I don't have a copy right here of the original. But if you look at my book, the cover's all battered. It's dog-eared. There's wine stains on it. But it just shows you, it's like, to me, it's like a talisman. It has a certain energy that it attracts me to. So yeah, that's how I make sense of that attraction or that acquaintance with the works of Marco Daffi, because he never wrote to be famous. He never wrote to make money. He never wrote, have a bestseller. He actually didn't write. He just wrote mostly letters and requests from friends to, can you write me a piece on this alchemical process you have? And he did it like that. So he wasn't, he was well off. So he didn't do it for money or for fame. And the fame he had with the trial of the Magus, which, he had enough fame for his lifetime in terms of that experience. So yeah, that's how I came across Marco Daffi, is through Kremertz, and Kremertz was through Evola.
Do you find that perhaps is there anything in Daffy's approach to Hermeticism that differs from other contemporary Western esoteric traditions? The people who may be more familiar with esoterica and they open up Daffy's book and they find something surprising or contradictory to something that they thought that they may know, or a concept that would really blow their minds, even if they're kind of more steeped in Western esoterica, Golden Dawn style, whatever.
Yeah, first of all, it's not based on the Kabbalah. It's not based on Eastern practices and traditions. So it's very much rooted in this Greco-Roman type of tradition that works from the bottom up, from the Saturnian levels. It takes consciousness from a human level and sublimates it into deeper levels, that of the hero, from the hero to the divine. So the Kabbalah has the 10 spheres of the tree of life. In the Miriamic tradition, it's the 4 bodies. It's sublimate, transform energy from the coarse Saturnian to the solar level. So that's the pathway. So it's much more simpler in that sense. And it's just the practices. He calls it, again, it's alchemical hermeticism as a gnosis. It's a rupture of the quotidian to be able to enter into this vortex that leads to a different dimension where one still remains intact of who one is. So one doesn't lose oneself. And one has the ability to exit from the astral plane to the physical plane through one's experience and one's ability. And he calls that the siren. The siren is a composite figure in terms that the mermaid or the siren has a human self and it has a shimmer, a divine self. And that represents the initiate that is able to be in this world, but not of this world. They can make jumps and leaps into the astral at will or through the techniques and instruments that they've mastered in their practice.
Do you think that he had a special spiritual mission?
He mentioned his spiritual mission was he called himself an incomplete avatar, in that, in the sense that he had this extraordinary perception of his inner self, his energetic bodies. And even Kremertz, who is known as a master, recognized this right away, that wasn't someone, just off the street, who's curious and wanting to learn. This is someone who's already come with a very mature and very heightening sense of consciousness, especially in their energetic cells. However, Daffi felt his mission was to repair his third body, which is lunar body, and that if he didn't repair it, he would be liable to reincarnate, or that his awareness of his archetypal self would incarnate that universal energetic field of the psyche, which represents Marco Daffi, if that makes sense to you, that when that incarnates, that would still be lacking, would not have fully realized his true potential because of that infirmament of the unbalanced third body or lunar body, the body that oversees love and emotions, what we call these days emotional intelligence.
Right, right. And a lot of people read books like yours, and I don't. It's sometimes used as as an insult in some of these circles, but armchair occultist. I don't think that that's necessarily an insult. I want lots of people looking at material like your book for lots of different reasons, right? And we see a lot more scholars and scholarship coming out around the occult. But outside of that armchair, just reading the book, do you see Daffi's teachings and practices as relevant to the here and now, to contemporary spiritual seekers and practitioners of Western esotericism, or maybe just seekers in general, or is it really something that belongs to its time, or belongs to people of a certain temperament or what are some of your feelings and thoughts on that, Dave?
No, it's definitely practical work that's relevant now as it was relevant in the past, it will be in the future. As I mentioned earlier, the archetype of this initiate is of the magical hero. So it's not one who rests on a group work. It's the hero, the Orpheus, it's the Ulysses, it's the Aeneas, the Dantes, who actually descend into the underworld, which is the underworld unconsciousness, to explore, to address, to deal with those demons, to deal with those giants, and like Jason in the Argonauts, that deals with the centaurs and so on and so forth. All those are what Daffi calls sacred representations. Those are all those forces that haven't been resolved, that are percolating below your level of consciousness. So for the individual to grow, to evolve, they need to address those, or else they'll always be hindered from them. So it's a very much a practical process. It's not for everyone, because not everyone is meant to follow that heroic path. Others are better in more doing group work and better in hierarchical situations. This isn't for them. So the material is highly symbolic in the sense it's not so much historically context, even though I have to write a biography because nobody knows about Daffi. So you have to give a sense of who is this person. Is it made up? It's not made up. There's a lot of primary material from artists, testimonies from artists, from scientists, from authors who knew Daffi firsthand and to attest to it. So yeah, that's been my experience. It's very practical. It's very universal in its theory and its practicum. It makes total sense. I think those who would read it and connect with it would find something, that would discover something new and novel that they hadn't expected that actually existed. I know myself, when I read that, it's sort of like, why did this, it clicked into me that there was some sort of precedent, that this wasn't so unique and on its own, that there had to be some other reference point. And the only reference points I can is if you read the story, the mythologies of the heroes. It's that same process of going in the underworld, of dealing with your unconscious nigredo, and going through these various challenges and trials and tribulations. Like Hercules, they had the 12 challenges. All those are symbolic of the process of the individual, that to transform themselves from lead into gold, they have to clean house. They have to do a lot of inner work, and a lot of times is a heroic nature, because the energies that you're working at, that sublunar level are just so intense, and they're just so tangible in the inner level of the self, of the individual, and the forces of that interplay that come out into what makes up the mind of their consciousness.
Yeah.
These are the forces that are behind that, and this provides one with the legend and the tools to be able to diagnose what they are and to understand it and to transform it.
Yeah. Well, I think that's a great stopping point there, though. Of course, we could go all night. So the name of the book again is Alchemical Hermeticism: The Secret Teachings of Marco Daffi on Initiation. Get it wherever you buy your books, but we'll have a link in the show notes. You can help us out at Talk Gnosis to keep the show going by donating at paypal.me/Gnostic, or you can subscribe to give us a monthly micropayment at patreon.com/Gnostic. Dave, thanks again so much for coming on. It's been a great chat. I'm really excited to have discovered this great thinker, this great writer, this great spiritual teacher. So I'm sure lots of other people are going to discover him through your book as well. So everybody, go out, get the book, and you can thank Dave once you have become enlightened. So thanks again. Bye.
Bye.